Hello, this video I want to show you how we can make the stylized grass with Houdini and Unreal Engine. So I use this in a personal project and I'm going to show you here a base breakdown of this. Now to start, here in Houdini I built a small system that can generate grass cards for me. So I use the hair system, the grooming system from Houdini to generate these. So now let's show you how I did that. So first thing I did here is using a grid. So basically on the grid I will then spawn these hairs. So the grid itself, it's super big at the moment, so I'm gonna make this smaller. I'm gonna do something like 0.2 and 0.1. So we're gonna spawn more grass here in the x-axis. We can also lower the divisions, but that doesn't matter that much. So that's step one, just creating a basic grid here. Now, next up is actually using the tools from Houdini itself. So when we open the shelf tools here, we have a lot of different tools. And by default, you should be able to see hair utilities or guides or other things. But we are starting here with like the hair utility tools. You can always find them here in the shelf. Like you can just look at it, what you need. So we're going to select our grid first of all, and we just want to add fur. So just click on this and just press enter. And now you can see that we can generate these nodes here. So we generated the 3 new nodes. And we can also see if we zoom in, we can already see a lot of these hairs working. Now there are a few things that I want to do. I actually don't need to deform, so I'm just going to delete deform. And I'm mainly going to keep it to here the groom and then the hair gen. We can also hide the grid if we want it, so we only see these hairs now. Now let's tweak this result a bit. So first of all, here is the groom. So these are sort of the guides where the hair will go. So let me take a look at the menu. So the density, we can, for example, lower this, let's say to 500, for example. And we can also do the length way longer. So we want them to be longer because we want our grass to be quite larger here. So somewhere like this is good enough. Then next up here, if I want to watch my final result, I can see that they are like having these multiple hairs around each guide. So I want to change that as well. So in here we can, for example, lower the density. And we can already see by doing that we can barely see any of this. So we're going to bring this very low, let's say 600. And I'm going to scroll down to where I actually have a value here for the thickness. And we're just going to increase this value. As you can see, we can now assign a certain thickness to our hair or our grass. So let's bring this to maybe 0.1. That's maybe too much. Let's do 0.01 then, and I think that's good enough. We can always go back here and we can play around with this slider. We can easily add more. We can have some seed in here. We can also relax the shape. So before a moment, let's just like keep it like this, and let's make this a bit more interesting. So now select the groom, and now we are going to use the guide process. So in here we have then set length. So we're just going to click set length, and it automatically will add a node here in our system. So this will override our length that I just set, but we can actually use the mode here to multiply by our value that we had here. So it will multiply by this value. Now furthermore, we can also click random and we can do some more randomizing. So let's say from this value to maybe something like this. So we have some random length, and so not every grass is the same height. So we have some variation there. We can further do way more settings here, like we can also do some masking, have some specific options and so on. But I think this is a good value to start with. So next up we can select the groom again, and we can, for example, use the lift. And you can see that something like this happens. And with the lift, I'm actually interested in here into the masking, and I'm going to use mask by curve. And we can see that with this ramp, I can actually control a bit more where this is happening. So if I would bring this down here, the effect of my lifting would mainly be happening here at the end. We could also here add some noise in there, and we can play around with that. So we can see that they sort of like bend a bit towards the end. So something like this is good enough. Then next step, I want to actually get some more noise and variation in there, and I'm going to use here the fizz guides for this. So once I click them, you can see that we have a lot of like noise going on, so they look like this now. And that doesn't look that bad. And we can always go here and, for example, change the frequency. So the noise is like larger or more. So we can, as you can see here, we can, for example, boost that if you want to. So you can have something like this. So this is the really basic setup for this grass. So now I'm gonna go actually in here into the front view, and this will then be the version that I want to render out or just take a screenshot of. And maybe some final tweaks so we can play around with the seed to a certain point that I like. So maybe lower this a bit again. Okay, so maybe this one could be nice. So make sure there is some like spacing in between them. That will help. And we can also go here into the material and we can click the arrow to jump to this. And in here, we actually can override the color. So now it has this brownish color because it's like using it for hair. But I can just use, for example, more grass color. So I can make this yellow and green, or maybe a bit more subtle. So we have like now this more grass color feel. So something like this. So that's basically it for the setup. So we can now generate a lot of different versions with this, and we can use this now in Unreal. So either to now export this, we can, for example, take screenshots, we can render this out. We can also here take a flipbook. So we can just click on the flipbook and render that out as well. So we can click on this. We can just say current frame. We can also say here beauty pass, so it will hide some of the UI elements. And that's it. So we're gonna make sure we also do, for example, a game size, and let's start rendering. And now we basically can save this. So we can just save this out here as a texture. And we can then manipulate this a bit more in Photoshop and go from there. And as you can see here, this is my result. So I just created an alpha map with this, and this is then ready to use in Game Engine. So you can now decide to make more of this and group them together in one texture. But for this video, I'm just gonna leave it like this as one. So this was a more procedural approach of creating these. You can always decide to, for example, grab like a pen brush and draw them here in Photoshop. But it's up to you what is easiest for you. Here in Unreal, I already prepared like a basic scene to then spawn my grass on. The scene itself is not that complex. So I have my model here. I just have like a basic light set to 4 intensity. I also just have a basic fog and also post-processing. And in there is basically here setting the exposure so it's more controlled. And that's it. There is not much else here in this scene. So here I load in my grass, and let's just start also creating a material for this. So grass tutorial, and we can then use here our grass texture. Let's also switch here to a plain card. Now in here, what I want to do is I also want to use a certain opacity mode, so I don't have opacity. So we're gonna go here to our blending modes, and I'm gonna just use a mask. So I can already connect my alpha to my opacity mode, and I have this now. Now for the shader, I am actually going to use the base color and the emissive. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use 2 multiplies, And in here, I have one multiply for the base color and one for the emissive. Then I also want to have a value to control this. So the value for my base color, that started with 0.2. And the value for my emissive, that started with 0.5. We can also expose this. That might be a good idea. So now we have this. And also I want to enable double-sided, of course. So double-sided material. So I have this result. So this is the most basic setup that I created for the grass to start with. But now I want to see this a bit more visually in my scenes so I can make it better. So we need a model for that. So here what I did in Houdini is just grab a grid. I'm gonna center this on the world axis, like so. Then I'm just gonna project the UV in this. So we're gonna give this a UV. Then I'm gonna edit this a bit. So when I made the grid, I also added a extra line here in the middle. And I can just like drag this out so my grass has a certain shape so it looks a bit better from different angles. And we can also add a gradient in the vertex color. And this can then be later useful. For example, when we do a simple wind through the grass, we don't want to move the bottom part. So we can save the gradient out here. And I can also here, for example, temporarily start viewing my grass here. So this is one of my first grass that I generated it. Then I'm going to just give it a name here, and then this is then ready to export with the FBX node. Pretty basic, just a plane and also a gradient on it. As you see, this is my result. I can already use this in the foliage tool. So let me delete this plane. You can switch here to the foliage tool. I'm just going to grab my model. And we can basically now start painting this. So we probably need a bit more than this to cover this ground. So let's try maybe 3000. That's better. And we can also make a height variation. You can play around here with the Z of axis also as well. You can also decide to not align with the normal. And I'm also going to disable actually the shadow because that will look nicer later on. So let me place the grass again. And this is then what I currently have. So let's switch back here to normal. So now I can, now I really can think about fine-tuning this more. So let's jump back to the material. So one of the first things that I want to take care of is actually creating a nice color variation. So I did this by multiplying noises. And the main noise here is made here in Substance. So I took two grunges, as you can see here, and I warped them together. And this gives me a nice sort of like a bit paintery pattern. And then I do a color gradient, and it will again give me this nice color variation here. So this is a texture that will control how my grass will be colored. So here I have that texture, and I can grab that and use that in my material. Now the way I'm gonna use this is actually I'm gonna use a world projection. So we can use one of the built-in features for that, which is called world align texture. So this can also be used for like triplanar projection. Here I'm gonna use this actually only in the Z-axis. So notice that this is also that we also need a texture object instead of this. So we can also promote this if we want to. And my texture is in there. We can also, of course, here set a size value. So this should probably be quite high. So let's start with 1000. And for the moment now, let's just override my base color here with just our Z-axis. And let's save this. And we can already see that this is start to looking a bit more better. So we have more color variation, as you could see. It's still not really blending that well with the ground, but that's for later. But now we really have like this cool color variation, so not everything is the same. So again, I use the world align texture. You can use other different methods, but this one gives me pretty nice result out of the box. And it's also really controllable because I can customize this grunge in Substance. Now next up, I also want to create already an instance for this. So I'm gonna right click here, convert, this is then the size, maybe size of the noise. Then this is a color boost. This is, for example, my emissive boost. We can already also expose, for example, the specter and roughness, but by default I'm gonna keep the specter to 1 and the roughness to 1. So specter 0, roughness 1. That should be good enough. So these are my base values. And we can now create an instance. So right click, create instance. And now I'm going to override this in my model. I'm going to open my instance here. And now I can easily change the noise scale, as you can see. Really interesting. You can also boost with some of the effects here. So let's reset it for the moment. So I have my base instance here. So now I want to make this even better. Like, it still feels a bit off. So it has like a quite dark look. And let's play around with the normal, and we can just use the normal of my material. And I'm gonna give the most basic normal value that we know, and that is the default value of 0.5 in the red, 0.5 in the green, and 1 in the blue. So this will give this the typical normal color. And we can plug this in here in the normal, and let's save this. And now it looks even a bit more weird. So one setting that I want to change here is if I scroll down, there is something here that is saying tangent space normal. When I turn this off and save this, I have now this result. And this already looks way closer to what I actually want. Also, if we would drag a certain model here, we still have shadows. So if we, for example, would start out with a unlit material, if we, for example, would use unlit material, we don't have shadows by default. So you can see that the color is quite consistent with what I just had, but we don't have like shadows from objects. As you can see, it doesn't cast any shadow. But now we have the shadow. Also important to know is that I'm playing around with emissive and base color at the same time. So my shadow here is actually controlled a bit by my emissive. So here you can see that I have a really dark color because I don't have any like environment reflections or so on. So now we have this. This is looking pretty good. And one thing we can do is we can already start thinking about blending this with the ground. So my ground color and my grass color are quite different in color. And one thing we can do about this is I could, for example, use my vertex color and use this to blend with the ground. So here we can place a lerp, and we can use this as my alpha. So this was a gradient. And my texture will be actually the second input. And the color, I can just start color picking, so I can switch to unlit. Place a color here, and we can pick this color. And you can bring it in here. And we can build something like this. So it's not perfect yet, so maybe I'm just gonna convert this to a parameter and just call this blend with ground or something like this. There are better ways of blending colors with the grass. If you're more experienced or up for a challenge, I can recommend you looking into virtual textures in Unreal. Really useful for blending these together. So now here with the slider I can blend this a bit more. So something like this is okay. So it's a bit more blending in there. Now we can also still use our original color if we want that. So we can also, for example, do a lerp between these two, like so. And then we can use this here, right click, and then call this like tri-planar amount or noise amount or something like this. So we can still decide how much intensity we have from that color. Now next up I also want to include the wind, so we even use the simple grass wind, and we're gonna right click here on these values, promoting them, and then the result from this, like I mentioned before, is gonna take place over the whole shape. So let's plug it in over here. Maybe let's bring in some base values in here, select 0.5, 0.5. So you can see that the whole geometry is moving around. So if I would multiply this by my gradient that I made in the vertex color, it will not move the whole geometry anymore. So save. So of course here we are not using my model with the gradient, but if I would look in my scene, I can see that the bottom of my model is just perfectly holding this, while the top is like moving around subtly. So now we are basically done, and the only thing left is to either like clean up this menu a bit more and play around with our values. So if you want more intensity of the wind here, we can increase this. If you're not happy with the color, we can still play around with this color, tweak more and more settings to make this look better. And we can of course go to post-processing and also start here adding certain like saturation values, like maybe boost this a bit more so it's like a more nice green color, or play around with this. I can also recommend you making more of these grass cards. So at the moment I only have one grass, so every single grass looks the same, but I can recommend you creating multiple of them, like 3, 4, 5, and this will help making this look more interesting and like more height variation and size variation in there. But this was the base setup that I used in my scene as well, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.